You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 20th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, Houthis sink a second ship in the Red Sea. We'll examine the effects of their continuing campaign of disruption. Also coming up, after Pyongyang, Vladimir Putin is in Vietnam. We'll see what he stands to gain and what Vietnam can ask for in return. Plus,
I have to have hope and dream that in my lifetime I will see peace and prosperity. I will see the younger generation will have a chance of education in the future.
We hear one young man's story as we mark World Refugee Day. We go through the papers and we'll find out why one political party in Austria wants to offer young people free newspapers. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. Canada has listed Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organisation. Germany has blocked a 14th package of EU sanctions on Russia, despite the scrapping of a clause that Berlin found problematic. And the CEO of Air France-KLM has criticised Aéroports de Paris over a shortage of jetways or air bridges, saying it's led to higher operating costs. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, it is a week since the Greek ship Tutor was struck by a boat drone loaded with explosives in the Red Sea, killing one mariner. Yesterday, it sank, bringing the number of commercial vessels sunk by Houthi rebels attacks to 2. Well, more than 6 months after the Houthis began targeting one of the world's busiest shipping routes, they have yet to be stopped. And to tell us more, I'm joined now by Iona Craig, a journalist who specialises in the Arabian Peninsula. Very good morning to you, Iona.
Good morning.
So just tell us, what happened to the Tutor?
There's actually been quite dramatic footage that has been both released by the Houthis of the attack and those who were on board the vessel. So it was hit by what appears to be 2 drone boats. The first one causing one explosion and then the second one doing considerable damage and appeared to have multiple charges on it, so that multiple explosions went off on the vessel at one time. And at least one of those hit the engine room directly, and that appears to be where the seaman was, who was then declared missing and presumed dead. It was, then the ship was evacuated and abandoned, and there was talk of a salvage operation being mounted by both the UAE and Oman. But, there was very little chance that they were going to be able to access the vessel without coming under attack themselves. So yes, the vessel then sunk, as you said, yesterday, and with one seaman missing and the rest of the crew were evacuated safely. But there's also another vessel that is currently adrift, having been abandoned under similar conditions, the Vladimir, which is now also at risk of sinking as it is damaged, having been a fire that broke out following a Houthi attack, and is also now at risk of sinking in the Red Sea.
Now, the reason for these Houthi attacks, just remind us of them again. They began after the Israel-Hamas conflict began, with the Houthis very much saying, we are doing this to support Palestine. But there seems to be what kind of pattern in terms of who they're targeting?
Well, yeah, the Houthis have claimed that they are trying to impose a blockade on Israel and that they are targeting Israeli-owned vessels or vessels that are docking in Israeli ports or ports of the occupied territories. But now that there is, no clear indication of any connection to Israel through ownership or otherwise of many of these vessels, in fact, most of them. And certainly the Tutor and the Vladimir, which is now adrift, there's no apparent connection with those companies that own those vessels in Israel or any other connection. So, yes, this now is a serious risk for all companies trying to operate through the Red Sea, which is why The Red Sea traffic of trade has dropped by 90% since December last year, because vessels and companies now are diverting and going around South Africa rather than taking this huge risk now of going through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. I mean, it's not just those two ships that have now been sunk. There have been 20 vessels that have been damaged, and 4 mariners now in total killed. So you've got issues now even of mariners who are refusing to sail that route through the Red Sea. You've got a backlog of a stockpile, if you like, of shipping in the Far East because of this issue of rerouting. So yeah, the Houthis have now had an impact on international maritime trade, and it's not just affecting Israel by any means.
And how much is this costing? I mean, you mentioned that container shipping through the Red Sea has declined by 90% since the attacks began in December.
Well, the most obvious cost is to Egypt, of course. It's already said it's lost 50% of its revenue of traffic going through Suez Canal when a vessel is paying, in the region of $500,000 to go through to transit the Suez Canal normally, and that is now being rerouted, and traffic is going around South Africa. But the other cost is obviously in transport costs, and that has an impact at the end on the customer, because you've got those delays and the extra cost of fuel and time at sea. With that route that takes almost double the time if they're going deep into the Mediterranean, but the war risk insurance. And that's the main reason why these vessels are shifting their routes, because before these attacks started, the war risk insurance for vessels taking that route was, below 0%. And now we're up to about 1% of the value of a vessel, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider the size of these cargo ships, and it is the cargo ships that are the most valuable, more so than the oil tankers. The financial sum of that just doesn't work out. It works out financially better for the companies to be taking that route around South Africa and paying the extra war insurance to go through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden.
Just explain to us a little bit about what is being done to try to stop the Houthis. I mean, we saw this, an airstrike campaign, US, UK, several months ago. That is continuing, isn't it? And what effect is it having, if any?
Well, actually, there's 3 military operations now going on against the Houthis. You've got Operation Poseidon Archer, which is the airstrike campaign, which is being led by the US, but also the UK is taking direct action in as well. So those airstrikes have continued. You've got Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is the US-led naval operation that is declared as being defensive rather than offensive, which Operation Poseidon Archer is. The UK is part of that. And then you've got Operation Aspides, which is the European-led naval defense operation, which is separate to the US one, because it was mostly countries that did not want to be under the US chain of command, which is why they separated, really. So you've got multiple navies now involved in the centre of Europe. You've got France, Italy, Greece, Germany, Danish Navy as well has been involved. Then you've got the Americans and the British. The Indian Navy has also been very active further south into the Indian Ocean, particularly with the uptick in piracy that we've seen. They've been carrying out rescue missions for vessels and crew there. But of course, as we've seen, these attacks are still happening. There have been periods of lulls in Houthi attacks, but Ambre, the security company that operates on vessels going through that route, have said that they've now in the last couple of weeks seen definitely more successful attacks being carried out by the Houthis. But you have to, give quite a bit of credit to those navies that are carrying out operations, because the defensive measures they've been taking. I mean, I think we've seen interviews from many captains from navies, in Europe and America, who've said their navies haven't faced anything similar at sea since the Second World War. And there have been, 136 anti-ship ballistic missiles fired by the Houthis, 10 anti-ship cruise missiles, 326 drones. And actually, the US and those European navies have managed to defend more than 80% of all of those attacks. So they're busy, but they are effective in that respect. What we're seeing a change in somewhat, though, is particularly with the French Navy. We've seen CMA-CGM, which is the French-owned shipping company, now getting a French escort, which is quite a different way of defending the shipping through that route. They're actually being escorted by French frigates now to do their weekly trip they do of 11 vessels that are now going back through the Red Sea since last month, which is obviously high risk, but it's also could be an economic win for them if they can successfully do that and do it safely with a convoy from the French Navy. And the US hasn't done that yet with US flag vessels or US owned vessels, but it may be something that the other navies look at if the French prove that they can do this safely for those what's called the Phoenician Express of CMA-CGM, which go through weekly from the Far East all the way into the Mediterranean and up through the Adriatic. So if they're able to do that successfully with their 11 vessels, you may see more navies now acting as convoys to vessels to secure their safety.
Iona Craig, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're with Monocle Radio. 13:11 in Hanoi, 7:11 here in London. Now, why is the Russian President Vladimir Putin bound for Vietnam? Only yesterday he signed a mutual defence pledge with a predictable partner, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. But what does he stand to gain from Hanoi? And why is Hanoi being so welcoming when it's currently a country plenty of nations want to do business with? Well, I'm joined by Bill Hayton, who's an Associate Fellow at Chatham House's Asia Pacific programme and a regular voice here. A very warm welcome back, Bill. Good morning.
Morning, Emma.
So, Putin has written an article in a Vietnamese paper sort of setting out his stall, hasn't he? What's he been saying?
Well, he's written in Nhân Dân, which means the people, which is the Communist Party Central Committee's sort of newspaper. It's the one that every government ministry has to sort of buy 20 copies of every day. And it's the mouthpiece, I guess, of the party. And unsurprisingly, he goes big on the past, the historic ties between Vietnam and the Soviet Union during the Vietnam War, the sort of solidarity shown in that time. They're playing up the sort of emotional connections, really. But that's certainly a big part of the story. But there are also, I think, some quite hard-nosed calculations from the Vietnamese side here. And I think there's also, from the, within the internal politics of the Communist Party, there's a sense that, Mr. Putin is actually, one of them. And that reflects some shifts inside Vietnamese politics in the last couple of years. So there's quite a lot going on here. What is it that makes them think that Mr. Putin is one of them? Well, in the last couple of months in particular, but it goes back a bit beyond that, what I might call the sort of the hardline group within the Vietnamese Communist Party has taken over. The new president is the former Minister of Public Security. You've got many of his supporters now in key positions, and they're sort of going to a much more sort of orthodox, sort of Leninist, the party controls everything kind of way of organizing things, much different from the sort of, there was sort of 10 years ago, there was a sort of more of a sort of almost laissez-faire attitude towards, how the Vietnam's politics was going to run in lots of ways. I'm exaggerating slightly. But now it's, very, very clear that we're sort of seeing a much more sort of authoritarian, much more like China, and they're therefore more friendly towards Russia as well going on. The interesting thing, though, is that Vietnam, in the eyes of of great parts of the world, is a place of great investment and great potential. Absolutely. I mean, you have this sort of situation where, for example, one company, Samsung, provides something like a fifth of Vietnam's manufacturing exports. Loads of international companies have got bases there. Intel, Boeing sells planes, all that kind of stuff. And so you have this sort of, I suppose you might call it a mismatch between, this idea that Vietnam is among the world's most open economies for investment and certainly for trade, trade higher than GDP, and yet an increasingly kind of authoritarian, group at the top. And I suppose the question is, can that continue indefinitely, or will there be sort of a slowdown economically because of what's happening in the top? And I guess maybe this sort of reach out to President Putin is a way of shoring up other parts of the system, we have different kinds of friends, we have options.
And could you see the likes of Samsung deciding that because of the way that the senior members of the authorities in Vietnam are pushing themselves in a politically contradictory fashion, that actually Samsung could find itself thinking, well, actually, we don't want to be part of Vietnam? Or are the business interests so compelling when it comes to Vietnam that actually politics has to be pushed to one side?
I think it's the latter. I mean, I think these companies have invested so much money in their plants in Vietnam. They're not going to be pulling out anytime soon. The worry is for future investments is sort of, is there a degree of uncertainty there? Can we, would we put another $1 billion, into a factory there when, we're not sure which way it's going to go? But I mean, I think, so some of what sort of this Putin trip is about certainly from the Russian side, it's about saying, look, we have options too. We can go and we also have partners in Asia. And some of it is from the Vietnamese side, saying, we are free to make our own choices. And, we're not going to be sort of dictated to by anybody, but particularly sort of, they mean the Americans, I guess.
Indeed. I mean, how much does Russia actually need this trip? Or how much does this benefit Vladimir Putin to touch down in Hanoi, have the red carpet rolled out for him in terms of the message that he sends both to Vietnam, but also to the rest of the region?
Well, I think it shows that he can do it. Vietnam is not a signatory or member of the International Criminal Court, so that means Putin can go there without risk of being arrested and sent to The Hague. But there will be some other countries in Southeast Asia that would absolutely not, welcome him. I mean, Singapore, the Philippines, other countries would most definitely not want to have Mr. Putin there. But there are, there are plenty of people in Asia that have a sort of nostalgia towards the Soviet Union for the support it gave to anti-colonial movements during the 60s, 70s, 80s. So there's a kind of emotional reservoir there. But I think, the actual degree of Russian trade with a lot of these countries is quite small. The exception, of course, is the arms trade, and Vietnam is a major importer, or has been, of Russian hardware. And that's quite important to keep its planes flying and its tanks rolling.
Indeed. Now, you mentioned the United States. And the United States, we've seen Joe Biden go to Vietnam recently, but we also have this very, very tricky relationship that Vietnam now has with China. How much does the arrival of Vladimir Putin affect the way that Vietnam deals with the enormous superpowers, the US and China?
I think actually this is quite important to understanding why the Vietnamese have invited Putin. Is the Vietnamese have their differences with China as well as having a political similarity, particularly in the South China Sea. There was a major set of disputes there, and I think the Vietnamese are worried that Russia is becoming too close to China. In the past, maybe they thought that Russia could be a sort of an independent player, that it would sort of support Vietnam, that it would maybe sort of restrain China. And I think this talk of the sort of no limits partnership between Russia and China has made the Vietnamese worried that Russia will not be its friend anymore, that it will kind of lean much more towards China, and that Vietnam wants Russia to be a more independent player, to help it when it has differences with China, to sort of be an honest broker, if you like, or even to support its long-time friend. So I think this is part of the calculations, is trying to persuade Russia to not go all in with China, but to be a bit more independent. Finally,
Bill, you've been covering Vietnam for a very, very long time. Did you ever think you'd see the day when it played such a pivotal role in geopolitics?
Well, it's fascinating. We've sort of become this sort of bellwether now, really. I mean, it looked, like sort of Vietnam was on a sort of trip to integration with the West and politically and all the rest of it. And then there's been this big shift internally. And it's now, is it a sign of the times? Is it a sign that, we kind of assumed that sort of that authoritarian model was on the way out, and now it seems to have got a new lease of life, prompted of course by China's massive economic rise, and that seems to have given comfort to other authoritarian countries around it, and bolstered those forces within those countries. So yeah, I mean it is sort of a real symbol, I think, of the way the winds in the world are blowing at the moment.
Bill Hayton, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were the Globalist.
You UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me on the line is Ruth Michelson, a journalist based in Istanbul. Good morning, Ruth. How's Istanbul looking today?
I knew you were going to ask me about that, and I regret to tell you it's very sunny, very warm, but we are, on the downside, feeling the effects of climate change. It is meltingly hot.
OK, don't worry. We have bright sunshine too, so we can step up and meet you today, but perhaps not with the glaring heat. Tell us what you spotted in the papers, please.
So most of the papers, plenty of mention in this part of the world of a speech given by the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah yesterday, threatening Israel with a war with the quote that's getting a lot of play is "no restraint, no rules and no ceilings." And this is essentially what could happen if there is a continuation of the exchange of fire along Israel's northern border, Lebanon's southern border, known as the Blue Line. Nasrallah, in a speech talking about Hezbollah's military capabilities, saying they've acquired new weapons, including a lot of locally manufactured drones. And this is after Israel talked about how that there has been a decision taken that essentially the Israeli army is prepared and ready and operationally ready if politicians decide that they wanted to launch an invasion of southern Lebanon.
There has been this ratcheting up of tensions and threats in the last few days, hasn't there?
I mean, this is an exchange of fire feels like it's not, doesn't really cover what's happened. We're talking about 200,000 people total on both sides of what's known as the Blue Line that have been displaced. Israel has used white phosphorus on southern Lebanon. There have been airstrikes, and Hezbollah has been hitting back into northern Israel with increasing amounts of force. And yes, and now we've seen this ratcheting up of this mention in the Times of Israel, in Al Jazeera, in the Washington Post, of this 9-minute-long drone footage of the port city of Haifa in the north of Israel, filmed in the daytime, shows a series of military areas. This is according to Al Jazeera, including malls and residential quarters, in addition to a weapons manufacturing complex. This was allegedly filmed by Hezbollah, and it drew some pretty afraid reactions in Israel, according to the Washington Post. That it was treated with shock as a demonstration of what Hezbollah is capable of.
Let's move to a story that we've been touching on for the last few days here on Monocle Radio, which is the Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia and the number of people who have now died in the heat.
Yes. So, I mean, one thing to note, obviously, what we were talking about at the very beginning here, the Hajj is a religious pilgrimage that is, because of the time of year that it's happening, climate change is affecting this, and the temperatures are getting hotter, and people are walking outside for a long time during the day. So a lot of reporting and not a lack of clarity about the number of pilgrims that have died this year. The estimates coming out from AFP, who have totaled estimates from people who are in the morgue in Saudi, as well as talking to diplomats in the region, is that at least 550 pilgrims have died due to heat-related illnesses. This is after the temperatures in Mecca, where the Hajj takes place, have been over 50 degrees Celsius. I'm seeing 51.8 degrees Celsius.
One of the issues here is the fact that those who have died, many of those who have died, are those who are unofficially travelling to Mecca for the Hajj. Those who are part of the official process are able to enjoy air conditioning breaks. But there is this wider question now as to how Saudi Arabia manages such a predictable and regular event in such unpredictable circumstances now.
I mean, I think There's the religious aspect of this, which means that Muslims are required, practicing Muslims are required to do the Hajj at least once during their lifetime. And so what you see in some places around the world is that in very impoverished villages, people save up to send one member of that village to the Hajj. And at the moment, the timing of Eid means that it's in the summer, it's in the blazing heat. And so Saudi has said that the way that they are handling, that they've made improvements to the number of people or to the conditions for the number of people coming. 1.8 million people came apparently this year. The New York Times reporting that they have said that this year's season was a success. But the reason that I mention the numbers of people in poverty who come and do this is that they get blamed by officials for saying that they weren't properly prepared or they haven't taken proper precautions, when actually Saudi is increasingly used to having these huge numbers of people coming and has tried to draw them in. So they've talked about these advanced cooling systems, etc., that they've used, consistent availability of water, and then apparently have made public statements saying that this year's Hajj was a success, but have made no public statements about the huge numbers of people that have reportedly been fainting and in some cases even dying.
Let's move on to the story we've been covering extensively, the visit of the Russian President Vladimir Putin to North Korea. And a moment ago we talked about his trip to Vietnam. The one thing that we haven't talked about is the sort of the trappings and the fripperies of these visits that often are sort of just as fascinating almost as the geopolitics. The accumulation of diplomatic stuff. Who handed what to whom this time?
Well, not just so much handed, but drove in this case. So there was, according beautifully put by Al Jazeera, a carefully staged public relations exercise where Vladimir Putin drove Kim Jong-un around in an Urus. This is a Russian-made model. Apparently, it's a model of his official presidential car in Russia. It's a Russian-made limousine. And according to Al Jazeera, Kim was seen grinning in the passenger seat while they drove around a park with the two men then swapping seats. But one of Putin's foreign affairs advisor, Yuri Ushakov, told reporters in Pyongyang with them that the two leaders exchanged gifts, which included the Urus limousine, as well as a tea set and a naval officer's dagger. And Kim then gave to Putin artwork that depicted the Russian leader. There was some reporting that this also included busts of Putin, which I'm sure is something that Putin desperately needs.
He needs lots more of those, doesn't he? Just let's touch briefly on the final story that you wanted to talk to us about today, which is people don't get on professionally and people have rivalries politically, which we're seeing increasingly in these days. But sometimes when it gets granular and gets petty, it really does get quite nasty, doesn't it? And you wanted to draw our attention to a Republican senator in the United States who's been doing some rather interesting things to their rival.
Yes, a rather bizarre story here. It's about Republican senator from Vermont who has publicly apologized after pouring water into her Democratic colleague Jim Carroll's bag for months, and has only apologized after she was caught on camera. So lots of pictures in the press of screenshots of the camera that the Democratic lawmaker Jim Carroll apparently set up in the cloakroom of the Vermont legislature because he couldn't figure out why his green tote bag kept getting soaked with water. He told the Associated Press the tote bag that he hangs in the hallway at the State House was getting soaked a couple of times per week in January and February. And then after he was charged with driving under the influence in February and returned from rehab, his bag was soaked almost daily. And so he basically caught his colleague on camera pouring water into his bag, and she has now apologized. And there are questions about whether he would decide to press charges.
And indeed, I mean, how happily have they resolved this? Because one gets the impression that although the problem has now been identified, they are far from making up.
That is right. So apparently he has been walking around, feeling paranoid about his colleagues. Now that she has... The senator that poured water in the bag, has publicly apologized and taken responsibility for this. They had a discussion at the end of this meeting where he looked at her and said, this is really using a word that I probably can't repeat on Monocle, but to say, this has really messed me up. And there were weeks where I didn't know who was doing this or why. So yes, consideration of whether he will decide to press charges for harassment.
And indeed, I think he said asked whether he forgives Morrissey, because Morrissey's the Republican senator who's done the water pouring. I mean, bear in mind, these are two people who have known each other since childhood and who go to church, the same church together. So one gets the impression that there is, a close familiarity between the two. Mr. Carroll said, I guess I'd have to say yes, whether I forgive her in the spirit of forgiveness. But if I had to be a smart-ass, I'd say her apology holds about as much water as my canvas bag. Ruth Michelson, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is just coming up to 7:31 here at Midori House. Let's have a look at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Canada has listed Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organisation. The country's public safety minister said it was a significant tool in fighting global terrorism. Germany has blocked a 14th package of EU sanctions on Russia, despite the scrapping of a clause that Berlin found problematic. Officials from the 27 EU countries had been debating the package for more than a month, including a ban on Russian liquid natural gas transshipments. Germany's hesitation is down to an internal disagreement between the Foreign Ministry and the Chancellor's office. And the CEO of Air France-KLM has criticised Aéroports de Paris over a shortage of jetways. Chief Executive Ben Smith said during the morning peak, dozens of planes are left without a jetway or contact gate, forcing passengers to use buses to reach the terminal. He warned this has created a daily struggle for aircraft parking spaces and has led to higher operating costs. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, few countries have achieved the diplomatic ties with China that New Zealand has won. But the situation has been complicated after a Chinese citizen was kidnapped in New Zealand and the authorities in Beijing are being accused of being behind it. Well, joining us now is Paula Penfold, a senior investigative journalist for Stuff in New Zealand, which has been following the story. She joined us on the line from Auckland. A very good evening to you, Paula.
And good morning to you, Emma.
Now, this happened some time ago, but could you just recap the events for us?
The particular incident that you refer to, an attempted kidnapping, happened in Auckland in 2004 of a member of the Chinese community who says that he was met by three members who said that they were representing the Chinese government. They confronted him and beat him with pistols. He was left with serious injuries and hospitalised. The kidnapping attempt was not successful, obviously, but he maintains that it was over the fact that he had been pursued by the Chinese government over financial charges of embezzlement, which he says he was not guilty of. The reason that even though that was a long time ago, it remained relevant for our investigation into Chinese Communist Party foreign interference operations in New Zealand, because he says he's been the subject, and we've seen evidence of this, harassment and intimidation ever since. And part of the purpose of this investigation, this exploration, was to understand for how long these interference operations had been going on in New Zealand.
How did you first get wind of all this?
We were approached actually by members of the Chinese community who feel harassed, intimidated, threatened, some who are considered dissidents by the Chinese government, and many of whom feel that New Zealanders are extremely naive about the level of CCP influence and interference operations in New Zealand. So they asked us to have a look. There has been some great work done by other journalists and academics in this field in New Zealand. But what we wanted to do was really to see if we could pull together some threads and find out more about what was going on and present it in a documentary format. It's a feature-length documentary called The Long Game that we've pulled together that we wanted to try to make accessible to a general audience, which really, it's filmed in a cinema verite style, direct cinema. So we wanted to kind of take the audience along with us as we made the discoveries that we did.
And what discoveries have you made? I mean, you talked about this one individual who is now left stateless after 2 decades of being persecuted by the Chinese. But what about the others?
We uncovered a great deal of evidence of United Front activity, which you'll be familiar with in Britain, and there has been plenty of reporting around this issue, this strategy by the CCP being played out in other Five Eyes countries, including Canada and Australia. So extensive evidence of influence operations, really. Proxies for the CCP forming relationships with and making substantial political donations to politicians, both at central government level, but also grooming, if you like, local body politicians, mayors up and down the country. We found evidence of control and censorship of Chinese language media in New Zealand. And we also looked into an investigation around a car crash in 2021 in New Zealand, which killed 2 Chinese dissidents when they were on their way to our capital, Wellington, to present a petition to a Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which was investigating foreign interference in New Zealand. Now, that did not show that there was any proof of sabotage, which had been raised at the time as a concern. But what it did unearth was that police who investigated that crash completely misunderstood the allegation of sabotage and investigated the wrong car. So we will never actually know now, since the correct vehicle was scrapped, whether or not sabotage was at play in that case.
Paula, the wider issue here is the fact that China is New Zealand's largest trading partner, and New Zealand does manage to have a healthy enough relationship with China and the United States to be seen as one of those nations which can achieve something which is often impossible with Beijing. So how does this affect that relationship?
That's absolutely right. And it would also be correct to say that it's been very much a diplomatic tightrope here, because we've seen what happened to Australia when they started voicing concerns about foreign interference by China there and beefing up their legislation to deal with that. There were some pretty severe sanctions and repercussions imposed on industry there. And there's been fear that that would be the consequence if we were to raise concerns over this issue. But I think many people in New Zealand are now realising, as our security agencies and as ministers who've been responsible for those agencies are starting to speak more publicly, as they have in Britain, over the extent of the foreign interference and naming names, naming China. I think people generally people in the Chinese community and the wider community, and certainly analysts who work in this field, are saying we need to be able to have a mature discussion around this. This is not an anti-China discussion, but it is certainly a discussion that needs to be held around whether we are legislatively prepared for this degree of foreign interference, and very firmly stating politically that we do not accept such foreign interference in our democracy.
Paula Penfold, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Auckland. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. Now, it is estimated that more than 120 million people globally have been forcibly displaced. So it should come as no surprise that the United Nations has designated today, the 20th of June, as World Refugee Day, to celebrate the strength and courage of those who've been forced to flee their homes. Well, one such person is Hamed Amiri, author of The Boy with Two Hearts. It details his personal story of fleeing Afghanistan after the Taliban put out a death warrant for his mother. He's also a One Young World Ambassador, meaning he's a member of the 17,000-strong community of young leaders, activists and entrepreneurs who are united by the common goal of resolving the world's most pressing challenges. Well, earlier he joined Monocle's Andrew Muller to talk about his role as a One Young World Ambassador and to share his story.
I guess my story started many, many years ago in Afghanistan, Herat, year 2000, and my mum giving a speech about women's rights. And that led into an execution order from Taliban and us fleeing home looking for safety.
And how long did that process take? The trip from Afghanistan to the United Kingdom at that, well, even now, but certainly at that time, would not have been a straightforward undertaking.
I wish it was a matter of days or months, but it was actually 18 months in total from leaving home and actually seeking safety in UK.
Now, this is a story that ended up being chronicled in your book of a few years ago, The Boy with Two Hearts, which told the story of how you and your family travelled here. What kind of responses have you had to that? Because it is often the case, I think, or I've noticed not just in the UK, around the world, that people tend to, even those people who can be a bit unsympathetic towards refugees as a sort of undifferentiated mass, when they're actually confronted with an individual story, they all of a sudden think about it much differently.
I think what I didn't expect, and was a really nice surprise, is how it became a universal story. People saw a family. People saw three boys, me and my brothers, love of football. But underneath that was a family simply seeking safety, and a real insightful of what that journey looks like, why people like my family made that journey, and how much you crave just simply settling down and finding a place to call home.
There was a version of this story told for the stage as well, and just it's not so much about your story in itself. This question is more about how it feels seeing your story told like that. Not many of us get the experience of sitting in the National Theatre watching our lives enacted on the stage. How strange is that?
Very. Seeing a younger version of yourself, seeing how much of a troublemaker I was, which I still deny, but also to be able to experience the family again and those fun moments and humor moments at the same time of the dark moments. It's just nice to kind of relive those and tough at the same time.
But for all the sympathy that your story has attracted from people who've read the book or seen the play, there is still an undercurrent of demonisation of refugees and stoking of fear of refugees in most countries which have them. But here in the United Kingdom especially, it has been a theme of politics in recent times, of the current election campaign. Are you able to just zone that out, or is it still difficult not to take it personally?
I think it's better both. For me, when people use the word refugee, I always say it wasn't a word that I chose, it was a word that was given to me. For me, it was a last resort. And I just want people to have a chance to know the stories behind the numbers or why people make those journeys.
Do you think governments, though, could or perhaps should be doing more to make the case that taking refugees in it's not merely an act of charity, it's not merely a cost, it is actually for the host country very frequently an opportunity? It
is, yeah. And if I look at myself and my brothers and my parents, all I wanted to do was settle down and give back, because I had a second chance. My brother went on to be a governor at NHS. My younger brother done the same. I was a governor for local college. And I think if the right program is in place to support the integration, then they do want to settle down. I did want to settle down and find peace.
Tell us a bit about one thing I know you're working on, which is One Young World. To listeners who are coming to that for the first time, how would you describe it?
An unbelievable experience is my first thought. When I attended last year in Belfast, I had a realization of being surrounded by so many future leaders looking to address global challenges. And I was inspired. I was given more hope that, by the way, I'm not the only person who really wants to be an advocate here. And you really kind of have a lessons learned of there's someone doing differently. How do I apply this in here and actually have an impact in society and community and internally as well?
And do you see your own role in advocacy as mostly on behalf of refugee issues, or are there other areas you want to get into as well?
I think for me, I had an eye-opening of the other themes around, education that I could relate to, climate and sustainability, displacement obviously was one of them. So I actually feel like I have more of a tool set of applying other stuff that I can make a difference, like education. Because I came to UK and I had an experience of education here versus my country. How would I do it differently to make sure people can have a better impact or access to education to have a future? So it allowed me to have a bigger scope than one theme that I thought I'm an SME, if I can call it that way.
And just finally, because it is a country, the one you come from, Afghanistan, which we do end up talking about a lot, as most journalists covering international affairs do, and usually not for terribly happy reasons. Are you able to feel any amount of optimism for what Afghanistan might yet become?
I've been asked that question many times, and when the Taliban took over again, someone asked me, and I said, I have to have hope and dream that in my lifetime I will see peace and prosperity. I will see the younger generation will have a chance of education in the future. I have to have that hope. If I don't, then I've accepted what is currently going on back home.
And that was Hamed Amiri in conversation with Monocle's Andrew Muller. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's enjoy a roundup of Southeast Asian news now from Erin Cook, a Jakarta-based journalist and author of Dari Mulut Ke Mulut, a newsletter about Southeast Asia. A very good afternoon to you, Erin.
Hi, how are you going?
Very well, thank you. Explain to us your top story. There's something awful happening in Singapore.
Yes, it's a bit of a shocking story from Friday afternoon. An oil spill just off Sentosa Island, which is the very fun sort of resort island just off the mainland of Singapore. A collision between a Netherlands flagged ship and a Singaporean oil tanker vessel. And it ended up piercing the hull and throwing 400 tons of crude oil straight into Singaporean waters.
Just explain to us the effect of something like this.
This is obviously never good, but for Singapore, it's extra bad. Singapore is, of course, geographically tiny, so an environmental disaster of any magnitude has the capacity to sort of throw off the entire city. But this is also where Singapore thrives. A disaster like this, the Maritime Port Authority was on the scene within 10 minutes, and the water agency had told Singaporeans not to worry. Their water source is all fine within that afternoon. So while it is hard and there is a lot of work to do and a lot of very sad photos of, birds being rubbed down with oil and fishermen are being tasked with keeping an eye out on sick fish, Singapore has responded really, really miraculously, really, all things considered.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that the fact that because Singapore is geographically and sort of economically so sort of prone to the sort of shipping risks, the fact that it gets it done so quickly. But what are the effects in terms of, these pictures of beaches and birds being, as you say, wiped down? What kind of image does that project?
Well, it was definitely a real bummer for hotel operators on Sentosa Island, which is wildly popular with not just Singaporeans, but also Malaysians, Indonesians, a lot of tourists within the region who love to come down on a long weekend, which, of course, this weekend was with the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Adha. And tourist operators have said everybody stayed away. We were expecting capacity. Nothing like that has happened. So in that immediate effect, we're seeing that. The Singaporean government, however, is saying, let's relax, let's wait a bit and see what happens environmentally. We might not be quite as bad off as it looks for the time being.
Let's move to the story to Malaysia. We have the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang in Malaysia and signing a 5-year economic and trade cooperation pact, haven't they?
Yes. So Malaysia and China have always had this amazing relationship where, of course, like historically, China has a huge influence in Malaysia. But in the last few years, with Anwar Ibrahim becoming Prime Minister finally after all that drama, it does seem to be even closer than usual. And this visit seems to be the solidification of that relationship. There are huge memorandums of understanding from everything from infrastructure, train lines, that sort of thing, to durian imports. Malaysia is very keen to get fresh durian into China, and Premier Lee says bring it on.
There is a wider ambition, isn't there, or a deeper ambition by Malaysia, which is to join the BRICS club.
Yes. So Anwar Ibrahim is very keen to get, and he always has been, he's politically quite pro-global South. He's been very critical of the US. He's very critical of the Western economic order, and he very much wants in on BRICS. So he's sent off a request sort of thing to South Africa, which is the chair, and I think we'll see some comments from Premier Lee supporting that quest after this visit.
Let's head to Thailand. It's celebrating marriage equality.
It's remarkable. It's probably a similar story everywhere in the world. We've had decades and decades of activists and advocates and just regular Thais demanding marriage equality for gay, lesbian, queer Thais. And finally, they've said, yes, let's do it. So that passed on Tuesday rather. There's a few little boxes to tick, royal assent and all that sort of jazz, but we're there. We're on the clear track. So it shouldn't be more than about 3 months away.
And universal celebration?
In Thailand, the rest of the region is a bit more wary. Thailand's the first in Southeast Asia to bring it in, and for the time being, it looks like it'll be the only country that has marriage equality. And it hasn't really been welcomed by some of the more conservative in the neighbourhood, particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, which have responded quite aggressively, at least sort of the people, certainly not the governments, definitely not. But in other respects, it's been really inspiring to the people of the Philippines who want to see marriage equality. So maybe bad in one respect and then great in another one. So hopefully we'll see some movement there.
Erin Cook, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were the Globalist. Finally, on today's programme, political parties are doing all they can to woo voters this year. Nowhere more so, arguably, than in Austria, where we've seen the rise of the likes of the Beer Party, which astonishingly came third in the 2022 presidential elections after offering a free barrel of lager each month to every household. Well, in a slightly less obvious move, and slightly more sober, one could argue, the Social Democrats are now offering newspaper subscriptions. I'm joined now in the studio for more on this by Monocle's senior news editor and half Austrian, Chris Chermak. What gifts are you bringing me this morning, Chris?
Oh my, I don't even bring any newspapers actually with me at the moment. I just have my laptop here. I guess I've totally missed the boat on that.
Okay, well, I'll be having that later because the Austrian political parties are quite good at handing stuff out to get people to vote for them. So tell us what's happening with the Social Democrats.
So the Social Democrats and their leader Andreas Babler made this proposal this week to basically offer €150 a year for subscriptions for print media to anyone 16 to 30 years old. That's the basic premise, and they put the offer, even though, as you say, there are certain gifts being offered by parties in Austria, they put it in extremely dire terms in terms of how they describe this, saying that, we are facing an urbanization of Austrian politics, press freedom is going down the drain, fake news is spreading everywhere in Austria, the young people of today are only focused on Facebook, TikTok, and getting their news from those places. So they place this as a very, very stark thing that needs to happen in order to protect Austrian press freedom, which has fallen over the last few years. The World Press Freedom Index had Austria at 32nd place, the lowest ever in this last report. So this is something that is sort of causing some head scratching among Austrian politicians.
What's gone wrong with the way that Austria runs its news?
There's a lot of different things. I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, you have a relatively high print readership in Austria compared to many other countries, about 40% or so. But that's not the case among the young necessarily, which is something you're seeing obviously in a lot of countries. So that's why this focus on offering free print subscriptions to younger people in particular. And then there have been various fights about press freedom in general. Austria's former chancellor, of course, Sebastian Kurz, ended up losing his job because he was trying to pay for favorable coverage. The current Chancellor of Austria, Karl Nehammer, has come under fire for certain judicial reforms that would reduce the access of the press to court documents and so on and so forth, whether they can cite court documents in the press and so on and so forth. So there are various discussions happening right now about the character of the press in Austria, and that's something that the Social Democrats are going after.
It's an interesting thing that you talk about the character of the press. Is there anything to suggest that actually the way that the press has changed in the last, or worsened in the last few years, has actually had a detrimental effect on the way that politics is run, or indeed how young people are engaging with politics?
Well, I mean, certainly like in many other countries, but arguably to a larger degree, you have a strong far-right movement in Austria, a populist movement. It's very well established, and you could argue that that is linked somewhat to the media, if you will, or the lack of a more objective media to some degree. The Freedom Party in Austria came in first in the EU elections for the first time earlier, just this year, a month ago. They are likely to win the next Austrian elections, which are coming up in September of this year. So that is a sign in itself. They've also been in government at various points, in coalition governments with the Freedom Party, with the People's Party as well. Sebastian Kurz himself, the former Chancellor of the People's Party, was himself something of a populist, if you will, somewhere in the middle as a sort of conservative populist, if you will. So you have seen this move to the right towards populism in Austria. Tabloids are extremely popular, always have been. Kronenzeitung is about the biggest paper in Austria as well. So in that sense, yes, there has been a character, if you will, of the Austrian media that is perhaps somewhat played up in politics too.
And, you know, in addition to this €150 sweetener, is there any genuine interest from Austrian young people in newspapers? Or are they doing what everybody else appears to be doing, which is going to their phones and following everything on TikTok?
Well, that is absolutely the question, isn't it? Whether something like this will actually turn the tide of Austrian media and sort of how the young people relate to the media is another question entirely. First of all, for one thing, €150 doesn't necessarily get you a newspaper subscription in Austria. They're often more expensive than that. So, yes, most young people in Austria are not necessarily reading the newspapers, although, as I said, it's a little bit higher than some other countries, but nonetheless, it's a weak point. Perhaps the young people, though, will go a little more for Andreas Babler's proposal for more football on TV. I will say that as well.
Well, this is the whole thing, isn't it? I mean, what can we in certain ways characterise the Austrian political scene by a place where free stuff is given and offered? I mean, the beer party is the great example of this, isn't it?
The beer party is, of course, the greatest example of something that, but to be fair, is something of a protest vote, although nonetheless, with their offers, they have done quite well. And so, yes, you can make some argument that the Social Democrats are jumping on top of those kinds of offers. As I say, in addition to the newspaper subscriptions, they've also made a comment. Andreas Babler has been pushing for reforms of the laws to allow for more football on public television, for example, allowing more national games and European Championship and World Cup games to the public broadcaster ORF. That's also something that is perhaps likely to be popular among the young and old alike in Austria.
Tell us a little bit more about how this is going to shape up the September national elections. The idea that beer, football, and to a certain degree newspapers are actually going to be the big discussion point.
Beer, football, and a small amount of newspapers as well as a result of this comment. I mean, yes, the elections are happening in September. At the moment, the Freedom Party is in the lead. They're looking to get as much as 30% of the vote. They could end up in a coalition government with the People's Party after that. The Social Democrats may come in second, and if they manage to do well enough with such offers as newspaper subscriptions and football, perhaps they could just about form some kind of national unity government to be a bulwark against the Freedom Party going forward.
Monocle Senior News Editor Chris Cermak, thank you so much. You can leave that keg of beer you brought for me in the corner. Thank you for joining me in the studio. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers Carlotta Rebello and Chris Cermak, and our researcher George Ruskin, and our studio manager Tamsin Howard. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. Hope you can join me for that if you can. And The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.